Welcome, and thank you for joining us as the Bipartisan Policy Center presents When Women Vote. My name is Matthew Weil, and I am the director of the Elections Project of the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are very fortunate to be hosting the session, which is based on the excellent new book by the National Vote at Home Institute's Amber McReynolds and co-author Stephanie Donner. BPC has long been interested in voting reforms that improve the voting experience. In January of this year, the BPC Task Force on Elections, which is composed entirely of current state and local election officials from across the country, released its report with recommendations to improve the entire election ecosystem, from registration to casting ballots and to how to count them efficiently. If you're joining us today on our Zoom feed, you have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists, and I encourage you to do so. Before moving on to introducing the moderator, I want to thank my team for helping set this up today, including Kalia Fernekes, Rachel Ori, Carolyn Cooper, and Tim Harper. Now, let me introduce Amy Allison. Ms. Allison is founder of She the People, which is the national network elevating the political voice and power of women of color. She is a former president of Democracy in Color, which is dedicated to empowering the multiracial progressive electorate through media, public conversations, research, and analysis. She holds a BA and an MA from Stanford University. She is a book author. She has written for and appeared on multiple media outlets, and today she is our amazing moderator. Amy, I turn the session over to you.
Thanks so much, Matthew, and it's an honor to be part of this incredible event. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and we've seen already the shifting election dates and confusing process to vote safely, where some people are thinking that they have to choose between how to be safe and how to exercise their rights as citizens. So this conversation about the voting system and the importance of women voters could not be more critical. I work with women of color. Women of color are a third or more than a third of vote eligible women voters, and increasingly more than a quarter of voters in the South and Southwest, these states that will be critical in November's election. And so I'd like to introduce our amazing panelists who will have a conversation with us today about the importance of looking at, examining the voting system and doing what we can to make sure that women are fully represented in this democracy. First, Amber Reynolds, one of the country's leading experts on election administration and co-author of the book we're going to discuss today, When Women Vote. Amber is the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute and Coalition, and she will join us today. Amber, say hi.
Hi. Great to be here.
It's good to have you here. Stephanie Donner, Executive Director of Emily Griffith Technical College and co-author of Women Who Vote. Stephanie is one of the founders of the organization and has spent her career devoted to the development of women and girls, formerly in Governor Hickenlooper's chief legal counsel, and comes with so much experience in this conversation today. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you.
Next, Jocelyn Benson. Secretary Benson is Michigan's Secretary of State, 43rd Secretary of State, and in this role is focused on ensuring elections are secure and accessible, dramatically improving customer experiences for all that interact with her offices. And she's author of State Secretaries of State, Guardians of the Democratic Process. Welcome, Secretary Benson.
Thanks for having me.
Last but not least, Secretary Kim Winan of the state of Washington. She's Washington's 15th Secretary of State, first elected in 2012 and serving her second term. She's only the second woman Secretary of State in the state's history. Prior to being elected to this office, Secretary Winan served as Thurston County Elections Director, so comes with so much experience from the local to the state. Thank you so much, Secretary Winan, for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me here, Amy.
Let's start with some grounding from the book's co-authors about women and the vote. The book begins with a short history on the 19th Amendment and talks about the voting issues that are encountered by Sarah and Kaylin, who are featured in the book. Can you just start by telling us a little bit more, Amber, about how the 19th Amendment is translated today and what challenges women have when trying to vote.
Sure. Well, Stephanie and I have been friends a long time, and we decided more than a year ago now to write this book because as we've looked at the landscape and looking at now the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment passing, while there's been a lot of time and there's been a lot of change, the one thing that hasn't changed is that turnout has been fairly consistent and fairly stagnant. There's still significant barriers in the voting process. And we really wanted to examine that further and tell the story about the need for change across the country. And so Sarah and Kaylin, one is a voter in Missouri, one in Ohio, and we talked to them about their voting experience in particular in 2018, and both experienced significant barriers that in some cases the system should have prevented, and in other cases were a matter of administrative procedural questions and things that came up. And what it told us though, and as we talked to more and more women around the country, is that there are barriers. And while we've come a long way, we haven't come far enough. And we see that with only 50% of the country voting in 2018 and 4 and 5 hour lines in certain states that experience it. And so we wanted to provide a framework and a playbook for improving the process overall, not only for women voters, but for all voters broadly.
Yes, and Jocelyn Benson, I guess my question is now with more than 24 states who have practices and policies in place that make it harder for particular people to vote, what does your research and storytelling tell you about what should be the top of the agenda in 2020 in terms of expanding the franchise and making it possible for more people to vote?
Well, certainly we're working in Michigan along with colleagues like Secretary Wyman, who's been doing this work for a while, for many cycles, to ensure accessible voting choices for voters are available for all citizens. That means in particular in times like these, enabling everyone to have a right to vote from home, the ability to vote from home. That right is in place in the vast majority of states. There are just a handful remaining, Connecticut and others, where past restrictions make it much more difficult. So that work continues, but that's only a part of getting the ability to vote by mail, and the choice to vote by mail is only one of the first steps you take in order to really build a robust system where everyone has a choice to either vote in person or vote from home. And we're seeing an acceleration of an exploration of those choices in the months leading up to the November election, given the coronavirus pandemic. So in Michigan, our voters in November of 2018 voted by an overwhelming proportion, majority, to amend our state constitution to give every citizen the right to vote from home, as well as many other rights, the right to be automatically registered to vote, the right to be able to register to vote up to and on election day, the right to post-election audits. So it's been an incredible opportunity to implement all of these changes this year for this year's elections, and now only have an increased sense of urgency to ensure that we're doing so in line with the needs of the public during this health pandemic. But the work is in some ways able to be efficient because I'm able to learn from colleagues like Secretary Wyman and others who have spent years perfecting and implementing these changes in their states. We're then able to take their best practices, lessons learned, and very quickly get up to speed if the political will and funding is available to implement vote from home in Michigan in time for November, if not sooner.
All right. Well, those are the two magic things, Secretary Wyman: the political will and the funding. Tell us about Vote by Mail, your effort to make that available to every citizen in Washington, some of the barriers, and what states should be learning from your experience.
Well, our experience in Washington was really years, decades, in fact, in the making. We started with a change in our state law in 1993 that allowed any voter to choose to be a permanent absentee voter. And over the course of the next 10 years, we really saw a dramatic raise in the number of people that were choosing to vote by absentee every election, absentee. And it really came to I guess, a tipping point when we saw counties hitting the mark of 60%, where 6 in 10 of their voters were getting a ballot getting a ballot in the mail for every election. And in 2004, our state had the notoriety of being the first state in the country to have the closest governor's race. And yeah, that was pleasant. Think of Bush Gore on steroids. That's how we really felt our election was. And one of the reforms that came out of that was giving counties the option to move to vote by mail, because what we saw in the 2004 governor's race was that counties were really struggling to conduct 2 simultaneous elections every time. You had to fully staff out and build all of your polling places and still anticipate that you were going to have, 50, 60% of your ballots returned by mail anyway. And you couldn't be successful at both. And so from 2005 to 2010, most every county moved to vote by mail. Our 2 biggest counties were the last, and it was political and mechanical. King County, where Seattle is, had to build out the infrastructure, the personnel, the space, the machinery to be able to do it. Pierce County, where Tacoma is, it was political. Their voters didn't like it because they had an auditor who had tried to shove it down their throats, their words. So it required the legislature to change the law to require all 39 counties to move there. So my biggest concern with what we're really trying to move to right now is making sure that states like Michigan that are building out a new system, that they do it well. I want to see Secretary Benson succeed, and that her voters have that opportunity to not only be engaged, but everyone believes the results because it's so well run and the security measures are in place to balance that access.
Yeah, I was wondering about what your experience has shown you, Secretary Wyman, in terms of how well vote by mail serves the entire electorate. Does it serve some groups of voters better than others?
I think it's a real equalizing method, and probably the biggest challenge is there are a couple groups that are more challenging to get that accessibility to. People who are living with disabilities. I think our counties have done a very good job of providing ways that they can download a ballot and use their own machines or equipment in their own home. But we do still have voters that need to come in person and use assisted technology. The other group, and this is the one that I cannot come up with a good argument against it, is people being coerced or undue influence. You have a woman who is in a domestic violence situation at home and is being forced to vote a certain way, and that's the one I can't overcome. I don't know how we solve that problem, because quite frankly it's a bigger problem than just voting. But we're still working on that, and how do you provide those opportunities for voters? Those are the 2 groups that are hardest. And then I would say a third, I lied, there's 3. Communities of color, certainly you have different cultural experiences with voting, and our counties, again, and my staff have been really working hard to go out to those communities, reach out to them, and figure out what it is in their culture or their community that may be creating a barrier in mail-in voting, and trying to work with them to overcome that. And I think that, again, our county election officials have had good success in tailoring that to the individual community needs, like any voting practice.
It's so funny. I was sitting with a group of Black women, and we were sharing our first voting experiences. And I thought I was unusual. I shared the story of how my dad took my hand. He would walk me to the polling place and say, "Your people died for this right. We will vote every time." And Black women, as you probably know, were the highest vote turnout of any race or gender. And all the Black women had shared this cultural experience with their parents and family members. It's a cultural moment to go to the polls. And I wonder about the controversy around, just kind of shifting to an earlier point, Secretary Wyman, that you made. Stephanie Donner, what is the onus, or what is the foundation of the controversy that you're finding around establishing and broadening vote by mail? Does it make sense to you? How do we understand this?
Well, it's an interesting question. And what you just raised, Amy, thanks for the question, was a question that we asked all of the characters in our book, including Secretaries Wyman and Benson, to describe their first voting experience and the connection that they had. And for those of you that haven't had an opportunity to look or read the book, they actually have an interesting connection among each other with military service of their husbands, in terms of how that motivated them to want to be sure to broaden the vote and the vote by mail in particular. I think there are controversies that are myths in terms of expanding vote by mail that just don't actually bear out whether or not it's secure, whether or not it serves everybody, how do you drop them off? Those are a lot of questions that have been successfully answered and debunked, if you will, by states like Washington, Michigan, and particularly in Colorado. And so we definitely use Colorado as an example in our book. Amber and I actually met in the 2013 legislative session when, she and I both worked from a different perspective on vote by mail here in Colorado. And so really what we've seen is that it's a change in infrastructure. It's changing infrastructure for a system that was created with bias because it was a system that wasn't created for everybody. It was actually designed to exclude certain groups of people, and initially women. And so while our book focuses on women, what the true takeaway is that until you look under the hood about the infrastructure that created the system, we're not really going to change it. And that applies in voting, that applies in education, which is where I currently am, and that applies in healthcare, climate, whatever it is that you care about, you can probably look under the hood and make a similar argument. And so in terms of vote by mail, we really say, well, what are the facts? What's working? And if you look at the states that have implemented this, they're the states with the highest voters turnout. And as we look to November, that's going to be a huge importance, especially if we now have not just certain groups like women or people of color, like we've all described, but the entire United States is going to be disenfranchised if we can't go to the polls.
Well,
and
this
so
is
now
yes.
even more important.
Yes, I agree. And I'm from a big family, so I just jumped right on top. Sorry about that. I wanted to just say, this is why Michigan, as a Midwest state, Secretary Benson is like one of the places people have your eye on. When we do, lift up the hood and look at the infrastructure that would be needed to implement vote by mail by, let's say, November, with the uncertainty of the pandemic and quarantines and that kind of thing, what's happening in Michigan?
Well, again, as I was saying, the great thing about Michigan is that we actually have been able to implement a vote by mail system quite quickly for really two reasons. One, the fact that it was voters who voted over 70% in 2018 to amend their state constitution to give them this right. So it wasn't a political battle. It wasn't a legislature imposing the opportunity or choice on our citizens. It was citizens themselves, the majority of whom said, we want to vote this way. So that actually positions Michigan to be to have the ability to succeed quite quickly in time for this November's election, because the voter education and the buy-in of the electorate is where we're starting from. And then the second piece is the fact that 5 other states, as well as many others, have 5 states have vote by mail where people are sent ballots, but also many others have no reason absentee, which is in many ways equivalent to enabling people to have the ability to vote by mail, or the right to vote by mail, which is what we have here in Michigan. So we've been able to import many infrastructure structures from other states that work, and I've been able to benefit from working directly with my colleagues in Ohio and Colorado and other states to get direct information from them, like Amber, about how to quickly train and educate our clerks and our workers here in Michigan to prepare for that shift. In our view, there's really 3 pillars, particularly in this moment, to building a system of vote by mail in Michigan that will be successful this year, and that already was. We had a March 10th election in which 1 million people voted by mail, over half voted by mail, and our results were in within an hour of the polls closing. We know that that's going to be a little bit different this fall. We're anticipating that probably 60% of those voting will probably choose to vote by mail, if not more. And that will be twice as many ballots mailed in than our infrastructure has ever handled before. So because of that, we are evaluating ways and working to change statutes to give our election workers more time and more resources to process those ballots and count them centrally. But all that said is, again, the 3 pillars that we've been focused on are: 1, the infrastructure itself, making sure that ballot delivery, ballot return, and ballot verification is all updated and modernized to prepare for more citizens voting from home than ever before. But the second pillar is voter education, making sure citizens know and have access to the information on how to exactly request a ballot and return their ballot and trust that their ballot's going to be counted, implementing ballot tracking systems that again are already developed based on other states that use them that we can simply bring to Michigan, enables us to get up to speed on that quite quickly. And then finally, the third pillar is countering misinformation. We want citizens to believe in the right that they have voted for themselves and created for themselves, to believe that that's going to work. And we know that efforts to confuse the process or sow seeds of doubt in the ability for it to be successful and trustworthy are efforts that we're going to have to fight from multiple different angles in this state and elsewhere. So we're prepared on all three fronts, but what we found already, having now conducted 4 elections, including 1 statewide presidential primary under this new vote by mail right for our citizens, is that the voter education and countering misinformation, improving voters' confidence in the process is in many ways just as important as building the infrastructure itself. And our focus is on all three. And then on the funding piece, just as a note, all of us have said at the state level that we want more money from the federal government in order to be successful this year, and that's certainly true. But the 11.2 million we recently received in the stimulus package, along with another 10 million that we received earlier this year from the Help America Vote Act funding allocated last December, has also positioned us to be able to upgrade our systems to allow for disabled and blind voters to vote from home and pay for the infrastructure there, pay to support the delivery and return of ballots for all of our citizens, including our military voters. So in many ways, the will has come from the people. The funding has come in support from the federal government as well as state and localities. And so I'm very optimistic for how things are going to run in November. And we know the eyes of the nation are on our state for many reasons.
Well, it's good to hear the optimism. I don't hear a lot of optimism now. And this is for you, Stephanie and Amber. We saw in the debates on the packages that were being debated in the House, the need to have money dedicated to helping voter education and vote by mail systems. Has enough been allocated to enable large-scale vote by mail for November? And what are the issues there?
This one's for Amber.
Yeah, no, there hasn't been. And our organization was working quite extensively at the federal level to educate really policymakers about the needs, because, when you look at the voting infrastructure, traditionally it's been underfunded. So the federal government hasn't really offered much in terms of support to states. So then when you introduce the pandemic, significant changes really quickly, infrastructure changes, as we've talked about today, that need to happen, there is a lot more that needs to be done. And the first allocation, I've sort of, in a nice way, tried to say that it doesn't even cover postage for ballots across the country. So there is a lot more that needs to be done. But I think the other piece of it is how is the funding coming and what is the bureaucracy around it? Because the time it takes the federal government to allocate money to the EAC that then goes to the states, and by the time it sort of makes it to the local election offices, which is, they're the ones that are counting the ballots, processing the applications, doing all that, it can take a really long time. And timing is of the essence right now. Timing is sort of the piece of the puzzle that is the most challenging to find and figure out, because we have so it's such a compressed timeline, and states and localities want to act, but they don't necessarily have the time to do so.
Secretary Wyman, your analysis about federal money, whether Washington's going to need that to implement or expand voting access to vote by mail?
Yes, I mean, Washington and all 50 states, quite honestly, I think Amber hit it on the head, that it was a very nice and lovely down payment. And we were really thankful, because I know my counties right now are already being able to put into action some real plans to deal with the impacts that even vote by mail states are feeling from COVID-19. We still need to have a robust workforce, for example, and the average age of most county seasonal workers is, and I'm being generous here, 65. It's really probably closer to 70.
That's 65 average.
Yes, well, it's probably 70. I'm trying to undersell it a little, but so we're looking at anywhere from 2/3 or half to 2/3 of our workforce not being available. And that's at polling places across the country. That's in ballot processing centers. That is in vote centers. And what are we going to do? I think that, just out of the gate, one of our biggest efforts is going to have to be getting personnel and having this robust recruitment effort, probably on par with the recruitment effort for World War II. And I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, but we're going to need that effort, and it's going to take money and it's going to take funds. And then you have that secondary tier that Amber talked about, and Secretary Benson also talked about, that you have to have the infrastructure in place to deal with that crushing volume. You have to have the time. I'm very enheartened to hear the words that you're going to try to extend the processing period, because that was my biggest fear and worry for you, quite honestly, on election night on March 10th, because we also had our presidential primary, and I was trying to send you good vibes in Michigan, Secretary Benson, because if your certification period is really short, you may not have the physical time and staffing levels available to actually process the ballots that are returned. And all of these things go to instilling voter confidence. Everything that we're talking about here today, if any element of it doesn't go well, for whatever reason, political or otherwise, the end result is people will not believe the results that are produced on, the election results for the primaries or the generals. And we can't afford to have that happen. This was the most anticipated election of the last century anyway. If everything had been normal, and now we add in the impacts of COVID-19, and I think the upside, I know I'm talking too long here, but the upside of all of the things that happened with Russian interference in 2016 and all of the interconnectivity we now have because of the cybersecurity, states are talking to each other in ways we never did before, because we just didn't have that infrastructure. And that part is what gives me hope, is the fact that we are able now to compare notes and say, hey, think about this, do this, I would suggest this, and have that connection. I think that our election officials are communicating in ways that we just couldn't have 5 years ago.
Yeah, just, in your mind, vote by mail is a safer option than the machines?
It's safer in the sense that obviously you don't have to have hundreds of thousands of people coming into single locations and being together and voting. But make no mistake, we're impacted as well, because King County, for example, a typical presidential election, they're hiring between, 150 and 300 extra help workers. Many of those people are out in the field looking at drop boxes and picking up ballots, but a large swath of them have to work in a single facility, shoulder to shoulder, processing ballots and checking signatures. So, they even are going to have to build out the space and the personnel and the shifts to be able to deal with that.
Yeah, I wanted, and I'm not sure who's best to answer this, so jump on in. We have a question from one of the audience members asking about the voting options for men and women who are occupied with childcare needs, and for whom the regular polling places have always been an issue, voting on a single election day. Talk about some of those issues.
You're muted, but we actually do address this in our book. I realized nobody had shown it yet, but we actually do.
I know. Okay.
Yeah, there's actually a lawsuit in, I think it was out of Illinois about a decade or so ago, challenging, actually asking for the legal right to vote from home, or in this case, it was termed absentee without a reason, for working mothers who weren't able to get to the polls on election day, or for single mothers. And I think those were some of the plaintiffs. I don't remember all the details, but certainly there's always been an argument that expanding opportunities to cast one's ballot, to both receive a ballot and return a ballot, are part of any effort to make voting more accessible and convenient for every community. So, it's really encouraging to see so many states move in a direction of essentially expanding opportunities for citizens to vote in a way that makes sense for them. One of the things that has always struck me, and one of the things we've really tried to implement in my office, is so much about voting. And in many ways, the way government works is saying, you come to us. And voting is very much an example of that. You come to us to vote. You come to where we say a precinct is, or an election center is, or you fill out the form that we create so that you can vote. And I've tried in my office at least to flip that, and enabling people to vote from home is certainly a piece of that, because that's saying we're going to come to you, we're going to get you the ballot. And there are lots of different ways to do that, but the overall philosophy or approach to governing in which we serve the citizens and therefore we meet them where they are at, particularly when it comes to ensuring their voice is heard and their vote is counted, to me has got to be a central part of election administration. And so, yes, we get caught in all the details, but recognizing every community has different needs and every individual in many ways has different needs, really listening to the needs of the voters and meeting them where they are with many choices of how they can both receive a ballot, either by mail or in person or other ways, and then return that ballot and have assurance that that ballot is counted. That's the essence of what all of us are trying to do in different ways to fit the cultures and needs of the voters in our state. I do want to add one thing, because the issue of can we find people to work our elections has been one that's emerged in various different settings that I've been a part of, as Secretary Wyman just brought up. And one thing we've done in Michigan to counter that, we actually have a local election on Tuesday, May 5th. And I could talk at length about how we are working to operate that election safely and securely in times of a pandemic, working to create social distancing and physical guidelines for those physical locations where people have to show up, open and process and count ballots. But recognizing the challenge of just ensuring people feel safe working in whatever capacity is needed on election day, whether it's in polls or to process mailed-in ballots. We put out a call to citizens all across Michigan. We called it our Democracy MVP program. Be one of democracy's MVPs, which are our election workers. Sign up to serve and work on election day. Just as Secretary Wyman suggested, really counting it as a way to serve democracy, protect democracy at this time when your country, when your state, when your republic needs you. And for our local elections, May 5th, about 10% of our voters have elections on Tuesday. So 700,000 out of 7 million voters are in jurisdictions. And so we weren't needing thousands of people to sign up. We just wanted a few hundred so that we could supplement cities and localities where people, for whatever reason, felt uncomfortable working in this moment at elections. And we, in about 10 days, 1,600 people signed up. Many of whom we were able to quickly train virtually and deploy to places throughout our state. And they were from nearly every county in our state, every one of our 83 counties, people signed up. And so that gives me also a lot of hope and optimism for the fall that given all of these challenges that's going to come to operating elections effectively and securely, what I'm seeing and what we're seeing in Michigan is the vast majority of citizens, so many citizens want, regardless of how they're going to cast their vote, to know that the election is going to be run well. And they're willing to step up and serve and even give of their time as an election worker in order to make sure it does. So that's very encouraging, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a surprising story to me, especially because many of us watched from the outside the election that happened, the primary that happened in Wisconsin, the controversy around that, and follow-up stories that showed that election workers weren't given adequate protections, right, and did come down with COVID-19. So I do think that one of the challenges that you've both articulated, reaching out to people in different communities to actually work the polls is something that a lot of people haven't been thinking about, but is an important part of it. Okay, I want to ask this question because this is in the book, and you all lifted up the book at the same time. I thought it was hilarious. All right, the states with the highest percentage of women in elected office tend to be the states with the higher vote by mail. Why is that?
I don't know. Michigan's one of the only states that every executive office is held by a woman at the moment.
And it's not, and Amy, just, one thing is it's not just vote by mail. It's the states that have implemented a number of the election reforms that we advocate for, because there isn't just one silver bullet. Without same day or automatic registration, vote by mail is less effective. And so there are these implementation of all of these reforms that—
I just want to stop you. And can you repeat that? Because I think that's a very key point.
That it's not just one silver bullet, that without the implementation of a number of the reforms working together that we advocate for, that's what really yields not only the higher voter turnout, but that's in our research and in our book where we say it's those states that also have the highest women in elected office totally. Comprehensively. And so it's, and to add on to that, there are also the states that tend to be in the West, or at least have started more in the West. And we make the analogy that suffrage also started Colorado was the first state to pass the women's right to vote through popular referenda. And that it was also one of the first states to implement these full package of voting reforms. So that is, and Colorado has, I believe, now the second highest representation of women in our state legislature, and second to Nevada.
Yeah, and the graph in the book is state legislative bodies. So the other piece of the puzzle is that with vote at home systems, it's actually been shown that voters go farther down the ballot to make choices. So they don't just stop at the top of the ticket, they go farther down to state legislative races and local races. And that's not, we see differences in that when you look at states that are mostly in-person voting on election day, or maybe they're rushed and they don't have as much time to research those issues. So there's benefits that the reform has on that kind of turnout increasing on those down ticket races as well.
You were mentioning, Stephanie, that there's no silver bullet. A lot of people are saying, you know, the watchword, we need vote by mail for November as the solution. And you're saying there's a whole list of reforms that we need to see happen. I want to explore the intersection between race and gender. Communities of color have been subject to voter suppression techniques and in some states, exact match, limited number of voting, in-person voting locations, and a number of others that you all know about. Talk to me a bit about the solutions in the reforms that would address not only racial disparities and targeting in some states and the gender issue.
Amber's probably best to answer this one because she's spent an enormous amount of time, advocating in some states for this exact issue, but we do address in our book. But Amber, take it away.
Sure. Well, what we say in our book and what we advocate for, certainly at the National Vote at Home Institute, is a safe, secure, accessible, and equitable voting process. And all of those values are important in making sure that the system is designed in an effective way. And so we know things like, you know, postal delivery can be a challenge, for instance, for Native American communities, or there could be postal delivery issues in certain communities within a state. And so we have to make sure that we offer a system that, number one, addresses that, but number two, preserves in-person voting options in a way that makes the process actually more accessible. And I think that the pandemic, you know, what it's really exposed is it's exposed the significant vulnerabilities of the traditional way that most people vote, which is, as Secretary Benson mentioned, the government assigning you to a location on election day is pretty restrictive, right? Because you think about it, people may work an hour away from where they live, and they might not be able to get all the way home to be at that neighborhood polling place. And so when you implement things like vote centers, which is one of the things that we call for, or voting at home options, and give people more days and more time and more options and meet people where they are, we can create a more equitable system because we're, you know, looking broadly at all of these sets of data, looking broadly at the voter experience for all communities, and offering those solutions and offering more ways to engage outside of waiting in a long line on election day or being confined in a location that the government tells you to go to. So I think
when a location closes, that you're supposed to be assigned to, and you don't have vote centers, or if your voter rolls have been purged for one reason or the other, if you have automatic or same day registration, some of that can be alleviated. So that's the intersection of the reform.
And Stephanie, how many states have same day registration? Pretty small number, right?
It is in our book, but you're gonna ask me to remember that. I'm gonna look it up, but Amber may know off the top of her head.
I think it's a small number, and we can agree on it's a fairly small number. I live in the Bay Area in California. We have same day registration. We have DMV registration. We're lucky that way. But I know I work with women in the South and Southwest who do not have that option. From the audience, and I want to encourage you, if you're watching, to send us your questions. Here's another one, and this one's going to go to either awesome Secretary of State on this in this event. What's the appropriate division of responsibility between the federal and state government when it comes to voting, voting systems, voting rights?
I'm going to let the lawyer go first.
My view is that that the federal government is there to provide funding and standards. That general, there should be a baseline that every state is expected to meet. The Voting Rights Act is a great example of that. No state should be able to discriminate in access to the vote. The Help America Vote Act, several other pieces of federal legislation have really laid out basic standards and expectations to promote equity among the 50 states, to ensure there's some expectation that every voter should have in a democracy, and then also to provide funding to go above and beyond the needs of the states that only the federal government has unique access to. And then our states are our laboratories. There are laboratories of democracy. They recognize, again, that voting is a very personal experience. It's a communal experience. It's one that that local communities as well as states can play a role in making sure works for every unique citizen's needs. And so in Michigan, where we have a very localized system of 1,520 election communities run each by individually elected clerks who then oversee their elections processes, and then 83 county clerks, and then the Secretary of State's office. We're very decentralized, and in some ways that's very helpful for many reasons, election security, access, and others. But in all ways, local, state, federal election administration is a partnership with all of us having a key role to play.
Ideally, Secretary Wyman, but the Voting Rights Act was gutted years ago. And so a lot of the federal protections aren't there.
Section 5 was found to be unconstitutional, particularly the coverage component of Section 5, which applied to 2 townships in Michigan, as well as, of course, many states throughout the South. But the basic protection of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which says that discrimination based on race in voting is illegal, provides that sword still for people to sue in any state where there is discrimination in place. Of course, the loss of Section 5, which required in certain localities with a history of discrimination that changes to election laws be pre-cleared or approved by the federal government before going into effect to ensure they weren't ongoing, creating more past discrimination, needs to be restored. And that's something that I'm hopeful that Congress will continue to take seriously, particularly under the leadership of Congressman Lewis. But overall, there's a federal role to play in elections, and it's one that is an increasing partnership and balance with the states.
Secretary Wyman?
She pretty much, she took my answer. No, I would agree with Secretary Benson. And I think that I would just elaborate on the strength and challenge of our national system of voting is really its decentralization. And particularly when you look at these highly contested, highly anticipated elections where the country is on edge and it gets down to a really close margin in states, and people are, start talking about things like, oh, this was a rigged election. This was all orchestrated and it was already a done deal before we even cast ballots. You can just really look at the 10,000 election officials who take oaths of office. They're appointed or elected and that run those elections. And, how are you going to fix that when you have people who answer to their constituents? And as Secretary Benson really hit on the head, just the sheer number of jurisdictions in each state that run elections. It's our strength, but it's also the challenge is, how do you find that balance between states' rights and federalism, I guess, or to get to federalism. So I think that it's going to get really tested this year.
Yeah, and it makes your role even more important, making sure that people can vote at the state level. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to go way back in history. This is another question from the audience, and I think this is the book's authors. And again, I'm going to talk about the history and something that you might already have in the book. Could you, both of you authors, shed light on how Victoria Woodhull, a leader in the women's suffrage movement back in the day, could run for president and receive votes in 1872 at a time when women could not vote in most states until 1920s, and I would say for women of color, that's 1960s.
I actually don't know the whole story behind that, but there were certain territories that allowed women to vote. So for instance, Wyoming, before they became an official state, could do that. There wasn't a prohibition on running for office, interestingly enough. There was a prohibition on women being able to vote, but there wasn't a prohibition on that. So it's highly possible that that they could run and certainly receive votes without actually any women casting votes and possibly not even being able to cast a vote herself at that time. So
how about that? All right, here's another one. I don't know who it goes to, but it's about fraud. And the question is, fraud's a limited problem in the US, but how do election officials address it? And what about ballot harvesting specifically, which I don't know what that is, but I'm assuming you do, Secretary Wyman?
I'll start and let others join in. Well, here in Washington State, certainly we've had a lot of time to build out our vote by mail system, and part of this real increase of access, and we've just seen it, in fact, in our registration side. We have same day registration, automatic registration, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds now in our state, and this will be the first general election, presidential general election, that we do all of those things at once. But we really took painstaking steps to build in this countermeasures of security to instill confidence, because those critics, and we certainly have heard the commander in chief make allegations about fraud, about vote by mail and absentee ballots. And our experience in Washington has been that, one, we check every signature of every returned envelope against the signature on file in the voter registration record. And we give that the option to the voter, if that signature doesn't match, to be able to cure it. And that does two things. One, gives a second chance to the voter, but also it gives a real fraud check, because I guarantee you that if Amber McReynolds gets a note from her county election officer that says, yeah, your signature doesn't match, she's going to get on the phone immediately and say, I didn't vote yet. And then a fraud investigation can be started. So in terms of that, that's a really critical piece in any element of elections, from registration to conducting elections, that you have that balance of security and access, and you keep it in balance so that you can convince the most progressive Democrat to the most staunch Republican that it was a fair and accurate election. And I think that in terms of the ballot harvesting, this is an issue that I am concerned about in my state. In fact, I dropped a bill this session that didn't go anywhere for, I'm sure, political reasons. But my concern is ballot harvesting, for those of you who don't know, is probably a negative term for people that go and collect ballots from voters' homes, mail-in ballots. And they go to door and they just say, hey, we're going to go make a run to the post office. Would love to take your ballot for you. We see it, I think, typically in campaigns because they're overzealous campaign people who want to try to get their side to win. And the problem with it is that you can't overcome a false allegation. They know that the Smith family is a staunch Democratic family, and we gave our 5 ballots to that Republican campaign for Wyman, and they didn't turn them in because they knew we were Democrats. And there will be no way to disprove that allegation, and now it puts doubt in it. And then we've seen in a couple of states where you've actually had some fraud activities related to ballot harvesting. So I think we probably need to put in protections for both the voter and for the ballot collector in those situations, again, to instill confidence and balance out that access and security.
And
Yeah.
Amy, if I could weigh in, I actually I just wrote an op-ed on this topic that was published on Tuesday with Charles Stewart. And I think what I would say, it goes back to the values that I outlined in the election, where we want to make sure it's secure. And there's techniques now that actually complement a vote by mail program, such as ballot tracking systems, which is something that Colorado has. Many states, Secretary Wyman has implemented similar reforms, and in Washington and California now as a state offers it. And what that enables is it enables a voter to track their mail ballot at every point in the process, just like you would a FedEx or a UPS package, and you get confirmation that your ballot was accepted and gone into the counting room. And so when we look at for instance, the North Carolina election fraud case, where the election was overturned, the result of the election was overturned, and they had a new election back in 2018, that was perpetrated on voters. It was a fraudulent thing done to voters, not by voters. And a system like ballot tracking, or even if North Carolina just had more options for voters, more individual options to make their experience better, that wouldn't have happened. And so, there are ways to protect against this. Again, it's exceedingly rare. We talk about some of these numbers in our op-ed just this past week on this issue. But again, need to protect the system and make sure it's secure.
Where'd your op-ed appear?
In the Hill.
Okay. All right. We're going to look for that. I want to ask you about an issue that was discussed a lot in 2016. It's starting to be discussed again, and that's the Electoral College, which is an arcane system that would allow at the federal level in the battle for the White House for one candidate to win a popular election and another candidate to take the office based on electoral college votes. Where are we in terms of the conversation of that and changing that system?
I'm happy to talk a little bit. I mean, I'm not part of any effort so I can't really talk directly, but my observation is that there has always been challenges and concerns around the ability of the Electoral College and the question of whether it is the most effective way of ensuring who wins the presidency is an accurate reflection of the will of the people. And as many of you know, and historians will have documented that there is racial animus underlying the perpetuation of the Electoral College, particularly in the 1970s when Strom Thurmond led others in the South to oppose its elimination around racial grounds. So, or is it voter suppression tactics? So there's challenges there, and actually Alex Kasar, who wrote a book, is behind me, is a historian that has documented many of them. There's currently an effort, though, an interesting one, to get states to choose, because every state can choose how to allocate their electoral college votes. Every state gets a number that is allocated, typically based on a winner takes all, who wins the presidential election, and that's how we determine the presidency. There's now an effort underway to shift for states to choose to give their electoral votes to whomever wins the national popular vote. I think there's a lot of details in that proposal that need to be worked out, but a number of states have already signed on to this compact. It would only go into effect if a majority of states signed on, and those closer to it than I am could tell you where they are in that process. And there are multiple efforts. This isn't just one effort. There are multiple ones with this idea of getting states to sign on to some sort of intergovernmental compact. The concern I've raised throughout this as an election administrator and as a Secretary of State of Michigan is anyone who's worked as an election administrator knows how important it is to get those numbers right, how important it is to have audits, how important it is to ensure that you're not changing or altering results and altering election. That, of course, leads to significant problems and chaos and confusion on election night and beyond in terms of who the winner is. So we don't really have a national entity that certifies who wins the national popular vote. It's usually added up by multiple states, and if there's a close election or the need for a recount, determining who wins the national popular vote could be quite complicated. And it is something that, and who gets to determine that, who certifies that election is still an unknown. So there's a lot of complications in it, but that said, I think, and I've always said that this is an important conversation to have, important things to explore, because modernizing our elections oftentimes as it relates to electoral college and other provisions are ways that we can improve democracy and make it more better reflection of the will of the people. So I welcome the conversation. I think there are a lot of details that need to be worked out, but it's notable that so many people do feel that something needs to change.
Well, and then on that note, the amazing thing just in our last couple of minutes is that in the midst of a pandemic, health crisis and economic crisis, that we're focusing on strengthening democracy to help us be a healthier society and move through the challenges we face. Very quickly, I'm just going to go around the room, our virtual room. Of all the things that you want to see happen in 2020, what's the one thing that you want people to focus on making happen? Secretary Weinman?
Oh, great. You make
You're on mute, and I'm sure that is a way to come up with a great.
I think instilling confidence in the public in our elections, pure and simple. We have to instill confidence. When this dust settles after this election cycle, people have to walk away saying the election was well run.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
Well said, Amber.
Well, I think in addition to that, I think making sure that every single voter can access the process in a safe and secure and accessible way is at least my number one priority at this point.
You're here. Stephanie?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you to Secretaries Benson and Wyman for your service and for committing to a nonpartisan run elections in both of your states, and to committing to ensuring higher voter turnout and higher integrity. And I would say to you, Amy, thank you so much for moderating, and my dear friend and co-author Amber for all the work that she does in the Bipartisan Policy Center for bringing us together. And what I would like to see is higher voter turnout with more people being able to participate.
I love that. Yes, higher voter turnout. All right. Last but not least, Secretary Benson.
Yeah, I agree. I'd love it. I mean, we talk about 80% turnout as a ceiling, as an aspiration. I'd love to flip that and have that be the floor, where we're constantly trying to have more than 80% turnout, particularly among historically marginalized and underrepresented communities. But to me, the election will be a success if people feel it is an accurate reflection of the will of the people, even if their candidate loses. That to me remains to be seen, but I'm hopeful with so many great election administrators at every level on both sides of the aisle that we can get there, and that we can counter and fight back and push back against any entities that would seek to harm public confidence in the election and depress turnout. And move forward after November and to future elections that will be held and continue to be held throughout our republic.
Such beautiful and inspiring sentiment. And I will just add that my dream is that despite voter suppression and despite the dangers of COVID and the fact that people are focused on, just basic human needs right now, that women of color vote at higher numbers than we've ever seen before. And that's going to require shifts, education, and culture. And that's my greatest dream, is 1 million more women of color turn out in November for the election. I want to just thank everyone for participating and for being part of this. She the People is here to make sure that women of color are, have a important voice and role in democracy, and this conversation helps advance that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew to say our final words.
Great, thank you. This is usually the point where I get to say to the audience, let's have a round of applause for all the panelists. So I will do it for you. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Amy, for being our excellent moderator. Thank you to the two secretaries and to the authors of this book. Sorry, I meant to hold up the book for you guys at the very beginning, but I have it on my Kindle and it had no color and it just didn't come out right in the video. So I do have my book. I will have to get one in print form to get it signed as well. But thank you again for being here today. We really appreciate everyone joining us. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. Thank you.